computer that is DNA, that is a multicellular organism, and then maybe the fascinating complex computer that is the human mind?
Well, I think you have to take just a step back to the complex computer that is the universe, right? All of the so-called particles or the waves that people think the universe is made of, and appears, to me at least, to be a computational process. And embedded in that is biology, right? So all the atoms of a protein, et cetera, sit in that computational matrix. From my point of view, it's computing something. It's computing towards something. It was created in some ways, if you want to believe in God. I don't know that I do, but if you want to believe in something, the universe was created, or at least enabled, to allow for life to form. And so the DNA, if you ask where does DNA come from, and you can go all the way back to Richard Dawkins and the selfish gene hypotheses. The way I look at DNA, though, is it is not a moment in time. It assumes the context of the body and the environment in which it's going to live. And so if you want to ask a question of where and how does information get stored, DNA, although it's only 3 billion base pairs long, contains more information than I think the entire computational memory resources of our current technology. Because who and what you are is both what you were as an egg all the way through to the day you die, and it embodies all the different cell types and organs in your body. And so it's a computational reservoir of information and expectation that you will become. So actually, I would sort of turn it around a different way and say, if you wanted to create the best memory storage system possible, you could reverse engineer what a human is and create a DNA memory system that is not just the linear version, but is also everything that it could become.
When we're talking about DNA, we're talking about Earth and the environment creating DNA. So you're talking about trying to come up with an optimal computer for this particular environment, right? So if you reverse engineer that computer, what do you mean by considering all the possible things that you become?
So who you are today, right? So 3 billion bits of information does not explain that 3 billion doesn't explain it, right? But the DNA embodies the expectation of the environment in which you will live and grow and become. So all the information that is you, right, is actually not only embedded in the DNA, but it's embedded in the context of the world in which you grow into and develop, right? But so all that information, though, is packed in the expectation of what the DNA expects to see.
Interesting. So, like, some of the information, is that accurate to say is stored outside the body?
Exactly. Yeah. The information is stored outside because there's a context of expectation. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, to linger on this point, if we were to run Earth over again 1,000,000 times, how many different versions of this type of computer would we get?
I think it would be different each time. I mean, if you assume there's no such thing as fate, right, and there's not a pre-program, and that there is some sort of, let's say, variation or randomness at the beginning, right, you would get as many different versions of life as you could imagine. And I don't think it would all be, unless there's something built into the substrate of the universe. It wouldn't always be left-handed proteins, right?
And I wonder with the flap of a butterfly wing what effects it has, because it's possible that the system is really good at finding the efficient answer, and maybe the efficient answer is if there's only a small finite set of them for this particular environment.
Exactly. That's the kind of, in a way, the anthropomorphic inverse of the multiverse expectations, right? That there's probably a zillion other kinds of universes out there if you believe in multiverse theory. We only live in the ones where the rules are such that life like ours can exist.
So using that logic, how many alien civilizations do you think are out there? There's like trillions of environments, aka planets. or maybe you can think even bigger than planets. How many lifelike organisms do you think are out there thriving? And maybe how many do you think are long gone before what's
I think, well, innumerable. I think in terms of the
greater than zero?
much greater than zero. I mean, I would just be surprised. What a waste, right, of all that space just for us, if we're ever going to get there. Um, that would be my first way to think about it. But second, I mean, I remember when I was about 7 or 8 years old, I was love of any of your listeners could find this National Geographic. I remember opening uh, the page of the National Geographic. I was about, again, 7 to 10 years old. And it was sort of a current picture of the universe. It was around probably 1968, 1969. I just remember looking at it and thinking, what kinds of empires have risen and fallen across that space that we'll never know about? And isn't that sad that we know nothing about something so grand? And so I've always been a reader of science fiction because I like the creative ideas of what people come up with. And I especially like science fiction writers that base it in good science, but base it also in evolution. That if you evolve a civilization from something lifelike, right, some sort of biology, its assumptions about the universe will come from the environment in which it grew up. So, for instance, Larry Miller, a great writer, and he imagines different kinds of civilizations. In some cases, what happens if what happens if intelligence evolved from a herd animal? Right? Would you lead from behind? Right? Would you be, in his case, one of them were the so-called puppeteers, and to them, the moral imperative is cowardice. You put other people forward to run the risk for you, right? And so he writes entire books around that premise. There's another guy, David Grimm is his name. He writes the so-called Uplift Universe books. And in those, he takes different intelligences, each from a different evolutionary background, and then he posits a civilization based around where and what they came from. And so, to me, I mean, that's just fun. But I mean, back to your original question, is how many are there? I think as many stars as we can see. Now, how many are currently there? I don't know. I mean, that's the whole question of how long can a civilization last before it runs out of steam? And you, for instance, does it just get bored, or does it transcend to something else, or does it say I've seen enough and I'm done?
What does running out of steam look like? It could destroy itself, or get bored.
So or we've done everything we can, and they just decide to stop. I don't know. I just don't know.
Is the Elon Musk worry that we stop reproducing, or we slow down the reproduction rate to where the population can go to zero?
It can go to zero, and we can't, and we collapse. I mean, so the only way to get around that is perhaps create enough machines with AI to take care of us.
What could possibly go wrong? You've talked to people that told stories of UFO encounters.
Mm-hmm.
What is the most fascinating to you about the stories of these UFO encounters that you've heard that people have told you?
The similarity of them, the uniformity of the stories. Now, I just want to say up front, a lot of people think that when I speculate, I believe something. That's not true, right? Speculation is just creativity. Speculation is the beginning of hypothesis. None of what I hear in terms of the anecdotes do I necessarily believe are they true. But I still find them fascinating to listen to because at some level they're still raw data. And you have to listen. Once you start to hear the same story again and again, then you have to say, well, there might be something to it. I mean, maybe it's some kind of a Jungian background in the human mind and human consciousness that creates these stories again and again. It's coming out of the DNA. It's coming out of that pre-programmed something. And Jung talked quite a bit about this kind of thing, the collective unconscious. But actually, one of the most interesting ones I find is this constant message that you're not taking care of your world. And this came long before climate change. It came long before many kinds of, let's say, current day memes around, taking care of our planet, pollution, etc. And so, for instance, perhaps the best example of this, the one that I find the most fascinating, is a story out of Zimbabwe. 50 or 60 children one afternoon in Zimbabwe. It was a well-educated group of white and black children who at lunchtime in the playground saw a crowd, and they saw little men. And they all ran into the teachers, and they told the same story, and they drew the same pictures. And the message several of them got was, you were not taking care of your planet. And it got, there's actually a movie coming out on this episode. And 30 years later now, the people who are there, the children who have grown up, say it happened to us. Now, did it happen? Was it some sort of hallucination? Or was it an imposed hallucination by something? Was it material? I don't know. But these kids were 7 to 10 years old. You see them on video. 7 to 10-year-olds can't lie like that. And so, whether it's real or not, I don't know. But I find that fascinating data. And again, it's these unconnected stories of individuals with the same story that is worthy of further inquiry.
Yeah, so here we are, humans with limited cognitive capacities, trying to make sense of the world, trying to understand what is real and not. We have this DNA that somehow, in complex ways, is interacting with the environment, and then we get these novel ideas that come from the populace, and then they make us wonder about what it all means. And so how to interpret it. If you think from an alien perspective, how would you communicate with other lifelike organisms? You perhaps have to find pinpoints on this interaction between the DNA and its manifestations in terms of the human mind and how it interacts with the environment. To get some kind of, all right, what is this DNA? What is this environment? I have to get it somehow.
Right.
To interact with it, to perturb the system to where these little ants, human-like ants, get excited and figure and see stuff out. Yeah, and then somehow steer them. First of all, for investigative purposes, to understand oftentimes to understand a system, you have to perturb it.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's look at it. They get excited or not, and then the other way is you want to. If you worry about them, you can steer in one direction or another. And this kind of idea that we're not taking care of our world, that's interesting. I mean, that's comforting. That's hopeful because that means that greater intelligence, which is what I would hope, want to take care of us.
We want to take care of the gorillas in the national parks in Africa.
Yeah, but we don't want to take care of cockroaches. So there's a line we draw. So you have to hope that.
Right now, we're a bunch of angry monkeys, and maybe whatever these intelligences are also keeping an eye on us. That you don't want a bunch of, you don't want the angry monkey troop stomping around the local galactic arm.
Do you think these folks are telling the truth? Do you think they saw what they say they saw?
I think they saw what they said they saw, but I also think they saw what they were shown. I mean, if you go back to the whole notion of, okay, how long has this been around? It didn't just start showing up in 1947. There are stories going back, into the 1800s of people who saw things in their farm fields in the U.S. It's in local newspapers from the 1800s. It's fascinating. But if you go even further back, so to your point of how are how would you, as a higher intelligence, represent yourself to a lesser intelligence? Well, let's go back to pre-civilization. Maybe you show yourself as the spirits in the forest, and you give messages through that. Once you get a little bit more civilized, then you show yourself as the gods, and then you're God. Well, we don't believe in God anymore necessarily, not everybody does. So what do we believe in? We believe in technology. So you show yourself as a form of technology, right? But the common thread is you're not alone, and there's something that's here with you, and there's something that's, as you said, watching you, and at least watching over your shoulder. But I think that, like any good parent, you don't tell your student everything. You make them learn, and learning mistakes, because if you tell them everything, then they get lazy.
You've looked at the brains of more information coming from the brain of some of the people that have had UFO encounters. What's common about the brain that people can talk
So the study started with a group of, let's say, a cohort of individuals that brought to me and their MRIs to ask about the damage that had been seen in these individuals. It turns out that the majority of those patients ended up being, as far as we can tell, Havana Central. And so, for me at least, that part of the story ends in terms of the injury. It's likely almost all Havana syndrome. That's somebody else's problem now. That's not my problem. Um, but when we were looking at the brains of these individuals, we noticed something right in the center of the basal ganglia in many of these individuals that at first we thought was damage. It was basically an enriched patch of MRI dense neurons that we thought was damage, but then it was showing up in everybody, and then we looked and we said, no, it's actually not. The other readings on these MRIs show that actually that's living tissue. That's actually the head of the caudate putamen. And at the time, and I remember even asking a good friend of mine at Stanford, who was a psychiatrist, what does the basal ganglia do? He said, oh, the basal ganglia is just about movement, nerve and motor control. And I said, well, that's odd, because these other papers that we were reading at the time started to suggest that it was involved with higher intelligence and is actually downstream of the executive function and involved with intuition and planning. And then if you think about it, if you're going to have motor control, which is centralized in one place, motor control requires knowledge of the environment. You don't want to move something and hit the table. Or if you're walking across a room, you want to be aware and cognizant of what you might bump into. So obviously, all of that planning requires access to all the senses. It requires access to your desires, memory, knowledge of where and what you want, and desire to walk nearby. Like, use the example of we're at a party, you want to avoid that person, you like that person, the waiter's about to drop something. All without thinking, you maneuver. So all that planning is done in the basal ganglia. And it's actually now called the brain within the brain. It's a goal processing system subservient to executive function. So what we think we found there was not something which allows people to talk to UFOs. I mean, I think the UFO community took it a step too far. What I think we found was a form of higher functioning and processing. So what we then looked at, and this was the most fascinating part of it, we looked then at individuals and families of those, let's say, the index case individuals, and we found that it was actually in families. And more so, this is the most fascinating part, we've probably looked now at about 200 just random cases that you can download off of databases online. You don't see this higher connectivity. You only find it in what Kit Green would have called, or has called, higher functioning individuals, people who are, and he called them savants. I don't have the means to We haven't done the testing. But as it turns out, my family has it, right? We found it in me, my brother, my sister, my mother. We found it as well in other individuals, husband and wife pairs. So statistically, if you had a group of 20 individuals and you found two husband and wife pairs, both of whom had it, and yet it's only found in about, we think, 200, 300 individuals. The fact that two individuals came together, two sets of individuals came together, both of them had it, implied either a restricted breeding group or attraction. The reason why it seems to be in, let's say, so-called experiencers or people who claim, if intuition is the ability to see something that other people don't, I don't mean that in a paranormal sense, but being able to see something that's in front of you that other people might just dismiss, well, maybe that's a function of a higher kind of intelligence to say, well, I'm not looking at an artifact. I'm not looking at something that I should just ignore. I'm seeing something and I recognize it for not what it is, but that it is something different than is normally found in my environment.
Yeah, I have a little bit of that. I seem to see the magic in a lot of moments. Like I have a deep, it's obviously, not obviously, but it seems to be chemical in nature that I just am excited about life. I love life. I love like stupidly. It feels like I'm high a lot. On like mushrooms or something like that, where you'd really appreciate that. So I'm able to detect something about the environment that maybe others don't. I don't know, but like I seem to be over the top grateful to be alive and for a lot of stupid reasons, and that's in there somewhere. And it's kind of interesting because it really is true that our brains, the way we're brought up, but also the genetics, enables us to see certain slices of the world. And um, some people are probably more receptive to anomalous information. They see the magic, the possibility in the novel thing, right? As opposed to kind of finding the pattern of the common, of the regular. Some people are more, wait a minute, this is kind of weird. I mean, a lot of those people probably become scientists too. Like, huh, like there was this pattern happening over and over and over, and then something weird just happened. And then you get excited by that weirdness and start to pull the string and discover what is at the core of that weirdness. And perhaps is that, maybe by way of question, how does the human perception system deal with anomalous information? Do you think?
Well, it first tries to classify it and get it out of the way. If it's not food, if it's not sex, right? If it's not in the way of my desires, or if it is in the way of my desires, then you focus on it. And so I think the question is how much spare processing power, how much CPU cycles do we spend on things that are not those core desires?
What is the most kind of memorable, powerful UFO encounter report you ever heard? Just to you on a personal level, it's something that was really powerful.
Well, I mentioned the Zimbabwe one. That's particularly interesting. And one that actually most people don't know about, but family driving down the highway, two little girls in the back, open glass top car, and the little girls see a craft right over the car. It's in the middle of the day on a busy highway. The mother sees it. They look around, nobody else seems to see it. So the girls take out their camera, take a picture of it, and then they get home. They look at the picture. There's no craft, but there's a little object about 30 feet above their car or so, probably about 3 feet across, kind of star-shaped. It's not the craft, but it's something else. There was something there. And so what were they seeing? Were they seeing a projection? Were they seeing and why were only they seen?
And the photograph was capturing something very different than what we're seeing, or still an object. What can you give a little bit of context? Is this from modern day?
It's modern day. Oh yeah, they had a camera. I mean, they had a cell phone camera.
And this is like a report provided. By the way, where's like a central place to provide reports? Is this?
Oh, there's MUFON, but this isn't public. I've seen the picture.
Oh, this is something you directly interact with.
Yeah, I've seen the picture.
So those moments like that, they captivate your
Well, it's so different. It doesn't fall into the standard story at all. But in another way, it's kind of it's a clear enunciation of this notion that when people see events, they don't all see the same thing. Now, you've heard this about like traffic accidents. Different people will see the color of the car differently, or the chain of events differently. And this tells you that memory isn't anywhere near what we think it is. But the issue around these so-called UFO reports is that the same people will see a very different thing, almost as if whatever it is projecting something into the mind, rather than it being real, right? Rather than it being a real manifestation, material in front of you, it's actually almost some sort of an altered virtual reality that is imposed on you. I mean, I think the company Meta and all the virtual reality companies would love to have something like that, right? Well, you don't have to actually wear something on your face, yes, to experience a virtual reality. What happens if you could just project it?
Well, that's the fundamental question from an alien perspective. When you look at it, or as we humans look at ants, how does this perception system operate? And not only how does this thing's mind operate, how does the human mind operate, but how does their perception system operate? So that we can stimulate the perception system properly to get them to think certain things. And so, that's a really important question. The humans think that the only way to communicate is in 3D or 4D space time. There's physical objects, or maybe you write things in some kind of language. But there could be just so much more richness in how you can communicate. And so, from an alien perspective, or somebody that has much greater technological capabilities, you have to figure out, how do I use the skills I have to stimulate the limited humans?
Right. Well, I mean, let's take the ants exam again as an example. Let's say that you wanted to make ants practical. You wanted to use them for something, right? You wanted to use them as a form of biological robot. Now, DARPA and other people have been trying to use insects to turn them into biological robots. But if you wanted to, you would have to interact with their sense of smell, right? Their pheromone system that they use to interact with each other. So you would either create those molecules to talk to them, to make them do. I'm not saying talk to them as if they're intelligent, but talk to them to manipulate them in ways that you want. Or if you were advanced enough, you would use some sort of electromagnetic or other means to stimulate their neurons in ways that would accomplish the same goal as the pheromones, but by doing it in a sort of a telefactoring way. So let's say you wanted to telefactor with humans. You would interact with them. And this is a technology which you could imagine possible. You could telefactor information into the sensory system with a human, right? But then each human is a little bit different. So either you know enough about them to tailor it to that individual, or you just basically take advantage of whatever the sensory net is that individual has. So if you happen to be good at sound, or you happen to be a very visually inclined individual, then maybe the sensory information that you get that's most effective in terms of transmitting information would come through that portal.
I think the aliens need to figure out that humans value physical consistency. So we've discovered physics. So we want our perception to make sense. Maybe they don't, that's not an obvious fact of perception, but you have to figure out what kind of things are humans used to observing in this particular environment of Earth, and how do we stimulate the perception system in a way that's not anomalous or not too doesn't cross that threshold of just like, well, that's way too weird.
Right.
So they have to. I mean, if that's not obvious that should be important. Maybe you want to err on the side of anomaly, like lean into the weirdness. So communication is complicated.
Yeah. Well, that's why I always find this issue of people talking about the so-called grays as interesting, because it is related to what you're saying. They're different enough, but they're not so different as to be scary, right? They're not venom dripping fangs, right? They're different enough, but they all it's also like they're what you could imagine us becoming in some distant future. So is that a purposeful representation? I don't know. I mean, I don't believe in the grays, for instance, but I believe that people think that they see it. So if we're talking about a communication strategy that says, we're like you but not the same as you, this might be a manifestation that you represent in terms of a communication strategy.
What do you make of David Fair's sighting of the Tic Tac UFO and other pilots who have seen these objects that seem to defy the laws of physics?
Well, I think you have to take them at their word.
Are they fascinating to you?
Oh, absolutely. No, I know a lot of these people, right? So I know Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, the whole crowd. I saw the videos about 3 weeks or so before they went public. I was at a bar with Lou overlooking the Pentagon in Crystal City, and they showed them to me. My hair still on end. He said this is coming out, and I know one of the guys on the inside who was in the naval intelligence who had interviewed all of these pilots again before this came out, and it was hair raising to hear this, but also exciting that here's not just people's testimony; these are credible individuals. If you've seen the 60-minute episode with some of the pilots, they have no monetary gain. If anything, they've got negative gain from coming out. But then you also have all of the simultaneous ship analysis from the USS Princeton, and the radar analysis, etc. So, at the end of the day, it's just data. It's not a conclusion. I'd be perfectly happy, honestly, perfectly happy if somebody showed that it was all a hoax. I move back to my day job, right?
That could be a hoax, but other things might not be.
Right.
This is the point. And I mean, this is why it's nice to remove some of the stigma about this topic, because it's all just data, and anomalous events are such that they're going to be rare in terms of how much data they represent. But we have to consider the full range of data to discover the things that actually represent something that's, if we pull at it, we discover something that's extraterrestrial or something deep about the phenomena on Earth that we don't yet understand.
Right. Well, if it only stimulates people, for instance, to think, okay, well, what happens if we could move like that with momentumless movement? And it stimulates young individuals to go into the sciences, to ask those questions. That to me is fascinating. I mean, after I've been openly talking about this in the last year, especially, I've had a number of students from top schools who aren't my students come to me and say, if I can help, let me. How can I help? I never had thought about this before, but you and others, not just you and others, have opened my mind to thinking about this matter.
Yeah, that's why it's actually funny that Elon Musk doesn't think too much about this. These kinds of propulsion systems that could defy the laws of physics as we currently understand them. To me, it's a powerful way to think what is possible.
Mm-hmm.
It's inspiring, even if some of the data doesn't represent extraterrestrial vehicles. I think the observation itself, it's like something you mentioned, which is hypothesizing, imagining these things, considering the possibility of these things. I think opens up your mind in a way that ultimately can create the technology. First, you have to believe the technology is possible before you can create it.
In my own lab, we always look for, as I've said before, what is inevitable. And, saying inevitably this is the kind of data we need. But if we need that kind of data, the instrument we want doesn't exist. Okay, so I imagine the perfect instrument, I can't make it, and you back into something which is practical, and then you, in a sense, reverse engineer the future of what it is that you want to make. And I've started and sold like at least half a dozen more companies using that basic premise. And so it was always something that didn't exist today, but we imagined what we wanted. And at the time, many people said it couldn't be done. I mean, for instance, all the gene therapy that's done today with retroviruses came from a group meeting in David Baltimore's lab. I was a postdoc with him, and one of the other postdocs wasn't able to make retroviruses in a way that he wanted to, and I realized I had a cell line that would allow us to make retroviruses in 2 days rather than 2 months. And so he and I then worked together to make that system. And now all gene therapy with retroviruses is done using this basic approach around the whole world. Because something couldn't be done, and we wanted to do it better, and we imagined the future. And so that's, I think, what the whole UFO phenomenon is doing for people. It's like, well, let's imagine a future where these kinds of technologies are, but also let's imagine a future where we don't blow ourselves up, right? So if these things are there, they manage to not blow themselves up. So it means that at least one other civilization got past the inflection point.
So if some of the encounters are actually representing alien civilizations visiting us, why do you think they're doing so? You suggested that perhaps it's to study and understand their own past. What are some of the motivations, do you think? And again, from our perspective, us as humans, what motivations would we have when we approach other civilizations?
Well, I think one motivation might be to steer us away from the precipice, right? Or on the assumption that, even if we make it past the precipice, at least we're not a bunch of psychopaths, running around. So maybe there's a little bit of motivation there to make sure that the neighbor that's growing up next to you is not, unruly. But I mean, maybe it's sort of a moral imperative, like what we have with, creating national parks where animals can continue to live out their lives in a natural way. I don't know. I mean, that would be. I mean, the problem is we were imagining from a anthropomorphic viewpoint what an alien might think, and as I've said before, alien means an alien, right? I mean, not Hollywood aliens, but a whole different way of thinking and a whole different level of experience and, let's say, wisdom, hopefully, that we could only hope to understand. Now, but if we ever get out there, if we ever make it past our current problems, and even if we don't have fast overnight travel, even if we're only using ram scoops or light sails to get where we want to go, and it takes us 10,000 years to get somewhere or to spread out, we might encounter such things, and we just got to stomp all over it, like we did in colonial South America or Africa or all the rest, on our current path, likely. And so what are we going to learn?
Well, we're getting better and better at understanding what is life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're getting better and better at being careful not to step on it when we see it. And this is one of the nice things about talking about UFOs is it expands the original window. It expands our understanding of what possibly could be life.
Mm-hmm.
It gets us to think. It gets the scientific community to think. When we go to Mars, when we go to these different moons that could possibly have life, we're not looking at living organisms. We're looking at some kind of complexity
Mhm.
that arises in resistance to the natural world.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of
I
interesting
like that resistance to the natural world. Yeah.
somehow there's a rebellious process, complex system going on here. And I don't know, the many ways it could take form. And there's a sense, for aliens that as the technology develops, they take form more and more as information,
Mhm.
as something that can influence the space of ideas, of the processing of data itself. I just, this idea of embodiment that we humans so admire, physically visible, perceivable embodiment, may be a very inefficient thing.
Right.
Right?
If you think just about your area AI, we're trying to make smaller and smaller and smaller circuitry that is basically closer and closer to the physics of how the universe operates, right down at the level of quantum computers, or basically right down about quantum information storage. So fast forward 10,000, 100,000 years, maybe somebody found a way to embody AI directly into the physics of the universe, right? And it doesn't require a physical manifestation. It just sits in space time. It's just a locally ordered space. We're just locally ordered space time, right? I mean, but maybe they found a way to embody it there.
They probably have to get really good at not, trampling on the ants.
Mm-hmm.
The better your technology gets, the easier it is to accidentally, oops, just destroy these simpleton biological systems.
We constantly think about whatever these things might be. We think that they are some sort of a unified force. Well, maybe they're not unified. Maybe they are as disparate as you and I are. And maybe what keeps them from stomping all over the ants is each other, right? That they are in a self tension to prevent one or more of them from running amok.
Oh yeah, I mean that's kind of the anarchy of nations that we have on Earth. So there's always there's always going to be
It's a hierarchy.
this hierarchy that's formed of greater and greater intelligences,
Right.
and they're all probably also wondering, wait, what's bigger than me?
Exactly. That's what I always wonder, is that maybe that what keeps them in line is something that is beyond them.
Like what created the universe? I mean that's probably a question that bothers them too. What about the communication task itself? How hard do you think it is for aliens to communicate with humans? Is it something you think about this barrier of communication between biological systems and something else? How difficult is it to find a common language?
Well, I think if you're smart enough or technologically enabled enough, it's relatively straightforward. Um, Now, whether your concepts can ever be dumbed down to us, that might be hard. I mean,
Again, talking to the ants
talking to the ants. I mean,
on Instagram.
so
You want to look good in this picture?
let me explain to you why. Yeah. So that's the essential problem of, you know, perhaps they realize who it is that they're talking to, and they say, we're rather than muddy the picture, we're only going to give them limited information, right? And yeah, maybe we could sit down like you and I and have a conversation, but then they would make assumptions. The humans would then make assumptions about us that aren't true, because we're not humans, right? So let's stay at arm's length. Let's just let them know that we're here, right? And here's the limited amount of communication. Again, this notion that if you give somebody everything, they'll get this. And, you know, if they've been around as long as they have, they've seen every kind of thing that can go wrong. And so it's they know as much as they might want, to step in, that would be a wrong thing.
Yeah, you have to also understand the amount of wisdom they carry.
Yeah. And so it's very easy as well for religions to. I don't want to get into a whole religious conversation. Very easy for you can see how religions could call them angels or devils or what have you, because again, if you're trying to fit it into a framework of cultural understanding, the first thing you reach for is God, and so it when you look at what these things are, and again, with the angels and the devils, in a similar sort of way, their communication is limited. They just kind of give little, what's the Oracle of Delphi? They kind of give these Delphic pronouncements, and then it's up to you to figure out what it is that they really mean.
Stephen Greer claimed that a skeleton discovered in Atacama region of Chile might be an alien. He reached out to him and took on the task of proving or disproving that rigor of science. The result is a paper titled Whole Genome Sequencing of Atacama Skeletons Shows Novel Mutations Linked with Dysplasia. Can you tell us the full story?
The story was, as you put it right there, correct. Reached out, got a sample of the body, did the DNA sequencing, then worked with a team of two other Stanford scientists and Roche sequencing group, Roche Diagnostics, and probably a total team of about 11 or so people. And as is standard in these kinds of things, the professors actually don't do the work. The students do the work and figured out the answer. And then we helped them put together the whole story. And the story was simply that it was human, 100%. I went into it thinking it was originally a monkey of some sort. I got kind of excited a few months into the process, thinking, "Oh, it is an alien." Right?
You would describe some of the characteristics of the skeleton that make it unique and interesting.
Primarily, it had dysmorphias of the brain. And so the first thing I did, actually, when I got pictures of it, I took it to a local expert at Stanford, and he was on the paper. And he was the world expert in pediatric bone dysmorphias. So he literally wrote the book and on this, because that's what you do. You go to an expert when it's outside of your field of interest. And he said, "Well, I haven't seen this particular collection of mutations before, or this physiology before, but here's what I think it might be." And he said, "But based on the size of the thing and the bone density, it would appear to be like 6 or 7 years old." Now, again, that's the thing where I think the lay public doesn't understand or takes a speculation like that and turns it into a fact. No one ever said that it was that age. We only said that the bones made it look like it was that age. But then we went back and looked for genetic explanations of why things might look the way they did. And if you, again, read the paper, it's very carefully caveated to say that mutation might result in this. What we did find was an unexpectedly large number of mutations associated with bone growth in this individual. And it was just a bad roll of the dice, right? You roll the dice enough times with enough people born every year, and someone will roll the wrong dice all at once. So the sad part about it was individuals in the UFO community who wanted to think that there was some sort of conspiracy around it, right? That somebody had somehow convinced all of my students to lie. I mean, come on, I would lose my job first of all, and they would all be, in trouble forever.
Yeah, but also it's just projecting malevolence onto people that I don't think exists in normal populace and especially businesses in the scientific community. The kind of people that go into science, I mean, this is what bothers me with the current distrust in science, is they might be naive, they might not, especially in modern science, look at the big picture, philosophical, ethical questions, all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, they're people with integrity and just a deep curiosity for the discovery of little things. Um, there's no malevolence, broadly speaking, in the scientific community. So, I mean, there's a bigger story here, which is, there's a hunger in the populace to discover something anomalous, something new. And, science has to be both open to the anomalous, but also to reject the anomalous when the data doesn't support it. Well, what do you make of that, walking that line? Because you're dealing with the UFO encounters, you're dealing with the anomalous.
Well, people have said, let's go back to the Atacama case, that I was debunking it. Well, debunking is a loaded term. It sort of assumes that you are going in purposefully to prove something is wrong. I wasn't. I was just going in to collect the data. And, I showed that this one was human. There was another skull that somebody had at one point. It was called the Star Child. They called it the Star Child skull. I said, I looked at it. I looked at the DNA sequencing that they had done. I said, this is human. End of story. The people who owned the thing at the time disagreed with me, and then eventually another group came in and proved that I was right. And it's not about debunking. It's about getting the more spectacular and hyped cases off the table. I mean, the reason I got interested in it is because somebody was hyping it. And not because I wanted to disprove it, because I just wanted to know it. And let's get it off the table, because it's usually the most extravagant things that are most likely to be wrong. Somewhere in the rubble will be something interesting. And so that's what you do. You get the dross off the table, and then somewhere in the data will be something worth real inquiry.
And that's, if you inquire deeply enough, will be extravagant.
Yes, exactly.
And that's what actually excites scientists to do. I mean, you want the rigor of science to actually reveal the extravagance.
And so look at CRISPR as probably the most perfect example of that. These weird sequences in bacterial genomes, all arrayed one after the other with these strange sequences around them. But when you looked at the sequences, they looked like viruses. And so how did they get there? Lo and behold, after a lot of effort and work, a couple of Nobel Prizes went out the door, but these strange things ended up having extraordinarily extravagant possibilities.
You've also looked at UFO materials. You are in possession of UFO materials yourself.
Claimed UFO materials.
Alleged UFO materials, that's right. So, with another term, weird materials that don't seem to
They have a story.
They have a story that doesn't seem to be of natural origins, but it's not, there's a process to proving that, and that process may take decades, if not centuries, because you have to keep going with the string and discover where they could possibly come from. But anyway, you're in possession of some materials of this kind. Can you describe some of them? Maybe also talk to the process of how you investigate them, how you analyze them.
Right. So let's say that there's two classes of materials that I've been given by people, and they're not given by the government or anything, just given people who've collected them, and there's a reasonable chain of evidence associated with them that you believe is not just a pebble somebody picked up off a road. There are almost always things that people have claimed have either been dropped off as like some sort of a leftover material, molten metals, or they are from an object that was released from this, so that kind of exploded. They're almost always metals. I have some couple of things that might be biological that are interesting that I haven't really spent a lot of time on yet. When you look at a metal, you basically know, okay, what are the elements in it, and what's it made of? And so there's pretty standard approaches to doing that. Most of them involve a technology called mass spectrometry. And there's probably about 5 or 6 different kinds of mass spectrometry that you could bring to bear on answering it. And they either tell you, depending upon the limit of the resolution of the instrument, they either tell you the elements that are there, or they tell you the isotopes that are there. And you're interested not just in knowing whether something is there or not, you're interested in knowing whether there are, the amounts of it. And in the case of elements, how many different isotopes are there? And that's kind of where, in some of these cases, it gets interesting, right? Because in at least the materials, as we first studied it, the isotope ratios, and in this case it was magnesium, are way off normal. And I just don't know why. It doesn't prove anything. All it proves is that it was probably accomplished by some kind of an industrial process, whether it's the result of a process, or whether, and this is sort of a leftover, or whether it was made that way for a particular purpose. I don't know. All I know is that it was engineered.